True respect often only begins when you no longer rely on others for your survival. It is a harsh truth, but one I had to learn the hard way. My name is Arthur Vance. I am a 67-year-old retired lineman, a veteran who served my country, and a man who spent 4 decades operating under the unwavering belief that blood was thicker than water. I structured my entire life around the principle that family comes before everything else. That conviction held firm right up until the evening my son's wife sat across from me at my own kitchen table, folded her hands with the cold precision of a corporate executive running a restructuring meeting, and gave me a choice: surrender my life savings or pack my bags and get out. I need you to stay with me through this narrative because the events that unfolded after that ultimatum completely reshaped my world. Let me take a step back to explain how a father ends up in his own spare room being cornered by his family. 3 years ago, my wife Martha passed away. At her funeral, my son Logan sat right next to me. He placed a heavy, comforting hand on my shoulder and gave me his word. He told me I didn't have to face the empty silence of grief alone. And he insisted I move into their house since they had plenty of extra square footage. I believed him without a second thought. I sold the suburban home Martha and I had poured our lives into for over 30 years. I didn't pack much to bring with me, just a few boxes of everyday clothes, Martha's framed photograph for my nightstand, and $214,000 in cash savings. That money was the hard-earned result of a lifetime of waking up before dawn, braving winter storms on power lines, and working until my knuckles bled. I unpacked my life into Logan and Cynthia's guest bedroom. For the first 8 months of the arrangement, things were passable. It wasn't a warm household, nor was it a joyful one, but it was manageable. It was the kind of artificial peace where you sit down at the same table for dinner, but nobody actually exchanges real conversation. It was the kind of environment where a polite good morning is met with nothing more than a silent nod. It was a fragile stability that required only one bad day to fracture completely. That fracture happened on a routine Tuesday afternoon. I had just walked inside from the backyard after spending a couple of hours repairing their main outdoor water valve, a job for which a local contractor had quoted them over $300. I washed the grease off my hands, poured myself a tall glass of cold tea, and took a seat at the table. Cynthia walked into the kitchen, pulled out the chair directly opposite me, and sat down with a calculated intensity that made it obvious she had been rehearsing this exact confrontation for weeks. She told me dead in the eye and addressed me by my first name. There was no warmth, no familiar title, just a blunt delivery. She told me that we needed to address the financial dynamics of the household. I set my glass down very slowly, keeping my composure, and asked her what dynamic she was referring to. I reminded her that I personally repaired every single appliance or pipe that broke down in the house. I purchased my own groceries every week, and I purposefully kept to my room to stay out of their way. I wanted to know what exactly required a discussion. She didn't flinch or blink. She told me that I was living under their roof completely rent-free, consuming their utilities without contributing a single dollar to the household expenses, all while keeping over $200,000 hidden away in my bank account. I want you to pay close attention to that detail. She knew the exact financial figure down to the penny. That meant only one thing. My son, the boy I raised, had gone behind my back and handed her that confidential information. I kept my voice entirely level and calm. I informed her that that money represented my entire retirement fund, the nest egg that Martha and I had spent 3 decades sacrificing to build. Cynthia simply gestured broadly around the room as if she were showing off a piece of prime real estate and stated that the house was an asset that she and Logan had to pay heavily to maintain every single month. Because of that, she laid out their proposition. They expected me to hand over $100,000 to pay down their primary mortgage as a permanent investment in the property. I sat there and just stared at her in disbelief. Then, without a single hint of hesitation, she added the alternative. If I wasn't willing to comply, I needed to find a different place to live. The kitchen fell into a profound silence, so quiet that I could hear a single stray drop of water from the outdoor water valve I had just repaired hitting the ground in the yard. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't shed a tear, and I certainly didn't beg. I simply picked up my glass, finished the rest of my tea without rushing, rinsed it out in the sink, and placed it neatly on the drying rack before turning on my heel and walking down the hallway to my bedroom. I heard her calling out behind me, demanding that we finish the discussion, but in my mind, the conversation had already reached its absolute conclusion. Later that evening, I sat on the edge of my mattress with Martha's picture resting in my hands. I looked at her face and spoke aloud to the empty room, telling her that it was time for me to move on. I could almost hear her familiar, reassuring laugh in response. Now this is where the situation takes a deliberate turn, and I want you to follow my steps. I didn't wake up the next morning and cause a dramatic scene by storming out of the house. I am 67 years old, and you don't survive 4 decades of hazardous manual labor, a major cardiac scare, and 30 years of marriage by reacting purely on raw emotion. Instead, I waited 3 days and stayed completely silent. On Thursday morning, I placed a call to an old friend named Marcus, who put me in touch with a trusted local real estate agent. The agent, a sharp professional woman named Beverly, immediately understood my situation and emailed me 4 property listings within a few hours. By Friday afternoon, I was walking through the front door of a modest, single-story, 2-bedroom house located on Elmwood Terrace, just a 12-minute drive across town.
The property was structurally sound, but required a fair amount of maintenance. The kitchen plumbing was loose, a couple of the front porch steps were rotting through, and the wooden privacy fence in the backyard was leaning over so heavily it looked ready to collapse. Yet, as I stood out on that worn porch, looking down a quiet, serene street lined with massive oak trees, I experienced a sensation I hadn't felt since Martha passed away. I felt genuine peace. I submitted a full cash offer that very afternoon with absolutely no contingencies. Beverly called me back within 2 hours to confirm the news, telling me the property was officially mine. I want you to remember that word, mine. At 67 years old, possessing a space that belongs entirely to you, a place where no one can demand your money or tell you to leave, feels like taking a breath of fresh air after being trapped underwater. I broke the news to Logan that same evening. He was standing by the counter eating some dinner when I walked into the kitchen. The property was structurally sound, but required a fair amount of maintenance. The kitchen plumbing was loose, a couple of the front porch steps were rotting through, and the wooden privacy fence in the backyard was leaning over so heavily it looked ready to collapse. Yet, as I stood out on that worn porch, looking down a quiet, serene street lined with massive oak trees, I experienced a sensation I hadn't felt since Martha passed away. I felt genuine peace. I submitted a full cash offer that very afternoon with absolutely no contingencies. Beverly called me back within 2 hours to confirm the news, telling me the property was officially mine. I want you to remember that word, mine. At 67 years old, possessing a space that belongs entirely to you, a place where no one can demand your money or tell you to leave, feels like taking a breath of fresh air after being trapped underwater. I broke the news to Logan that same evening. He was standing by the counter eating some dinner when I walked into the kitchen and informed him that I had purchased a home and would be completely moved out before the end of the month. He turned around very slowly, looking stunned. I looked at him and told him that I wasn't carrying any anger, and I truly meant it, but I made it clear that I would never hand over my savings account, nor would I remain in a house where my presence was treated as a financial burden. He opened his mouth to speak, closed it, and then uttered a phrase that I will never forget as long as I live. He claimed it was just a misunderstanding, and that Cynthia hadn't meant the ultimatum the way it sounded. I stared at my son for a long, heavy moment. This was the same boy I had coached through Little League, driven to his high school dances, and stayed up with in the hospital when a severe illness nearly took his life at 19. I told him quietly that his wife had given me a definitive threat at my own dinner table, and we both knew exactly what she meant. Without waiting for a response, I went back to my room and began placing my things into boxes. Moving day arrived on a bitter, overcast Saturday morning in March. I refused to hire professional movers. Marcus pulled up the driveway in his pickup truck, and the two of us managed to load all of my belongings into the back within 2 hours. Cynthia remained locked in her bedroom the entire time, never once showing her face. Logan carried a single cardboard box out to the vehicle, then stood out in the driveway with his hands buried deep in his pockets while I handled the remainder of the lifting. Just as I was about to climb into the passenger seat of Marcus's truck, Logan looked up and said that I didn't have to go through with this. I buckled my seatbelt, looked out the window, and told him that his wife didn't have to give me an ultimatum either. Marcus shifted the truck into drive and pulled away from the curb. I didn't look back in the rearview mirror once. I spent my very first evening on Elmwood Terrace sitting quietly out on the porch with a hot mug of coffee. There was no television blaring, no background noise, and none of that heavy, suffocating tension that used to follow me every time I walked through the hallways of my son's house. There were just the shadows of the old oak trees, the soft glow of the streetlights, and the peaceful, comforting sound of a quiet neighborhood settling into the night. As I sat there, a calm, slightly amused voice called out from the darkness of the porch right next door. The speaker asked if I was the man who had finally bought Old Man Miller's place. I turned my head toward the sound. Sitting in a wicker rocking chair that I hadn't noticed earlier was a woman wrapped tightly in a bright yellow cardigan. She was holding a large ceramic mug of tea with an air of absolute authority. I stood up politely, introduced myself as Arthur Vance, and nodded. She gave me a slow, deliberate nod in return, looking me up and down the way an experienced judge evaluates someone to see if they are worth a conversation. After a moment, she introduced herself as Clara Vance. She gave me a fair warning, stating that she kept unusual hours, held incredibly rigid opinions regarding lawn maintenance, and baked the absolute best peach cobbler on the entire block. I found myself smiling truly for the first time in months. I repeated my name to her, feeling somehow that she was the kind of person who deserved to hear it clearly. She lifted her mug toward me in a silent toast, and just like that, without any grand announcements, my new life began. What I didn't know then was that Clara was about to completely shift my perspective on what family really means. And Logan was about to learn a very painful lesson about the true cost of allowing greed to drive a father away from his own blood. There is something about starting over at 67 that nobody ever mentions in conversation. It doesn't actually feel like you are beginning from scratch. It feels like you are finally arriving exactly where you were always meant to be. During that first full week on Elmwood Terrace, I mostly kept to myself, which is just my natural disposition. I unpacked my belongings at a leisurely pace. On my very first day, I completely replaced the loose kitchen plumbing because I am simply incapable of living in a house without immediately repairing whatever is broken. By the third day, I had pulled up the rotting boards on the front porch and laid down fresh timber. By the fifth day, I was standing out in the backyard glaring at that leaning wooden privacy fence as if it had personally insulted my integrity. I was standing there, mentally calculating the materials needed to tear the structure down, when I heard her voice again. Clara spoke from her side of the property line, never even looking up from the hardbook book resting in her lap. She informed me that the fence had been leaning at that exact angle for nearly 5 years. She noted that the previous owners had spent 4 years arguing over who was supposed to pay for the repairs before they finally gave up and listed the house for sale. I looked over at her and asked why she had never bothered to fix it herself if it bothered her. She turned to Paige casually and replied that it wasn't her offense. I let out a loud, genuine laugh, the kind of spontaneous laugh that catches you completely off guard because you had forgotten you still had that kind of joy stored up inside you. I admitted she had a fair point. She finally looked up over the rims of her reading glasses and told me that the lumber yard down on Pine Street carried the best cedar planks in town. She told me to mention her name to the owner, explaining that he gave a decent discount to people she actually tolerated. I paused, looking at her curiously, and asked how she could possibly know she tolerated me when we had only spoken twice. She simply went back to her book and said she just knew what she knew.
You need to understand the kind of person Clara Vance was before this account goes any further, because she wasn't just a neighbor, she was an absolute force of nature. At 64 years old, she was a retired high school principal who had been widowed 5 years prior when her husband, a quiet man named Thomas, suffered a sudden medical emergency while out on a golf course in North Carolina. According to Clara, he passed away doing exactly what he loved, which she always said told you everything you ever needed to know about Thomas. She shared that memory with a gentle smile that carried an equal balance of lingering grief and deep affection, the kind of expression that takes decades of shared life to truly build. She had a daughter living out in Denver who made sure to call her every single Sunday afternoon. Clara spent her time cultivating pristine tomatoes in raised wooden beds along her property line with the meticulous precision of a scientist conducting a laboratory experiment. She brewed her morning tea strong enough to dissolve rust, and she possessed the rare, incredible superpower of saying exactly what was on her mind without ever coming across as malicious or cruel. I had genuinely never encountered anyone like her. I want to be completely transparent with you. I wasn't looking for companionship or a new relationship. That is the absolute truth. I wasn't experiencing the kind of hollow loneliness that makes a person desperate for company. I had my morning coffee, my peaceful front porch, my backyard fence project, and my hard-won independence. I was perfectly content. But Clara had a distinct way of simply entering your life and rearranging the emotional furniture while you were still trying to decide whether or not to invite her inside. It all truly began with that legendary peach cobbler. On my 9th evening on Elmwood Terrace, I was sitting out on the porch after finishing my dinner when she marched across the lawn and appeared at the bottom of my steps. She was holding a heavy ceramic baking dish securely covered in aluminum foil, as if she were delivering critical evidence to a crime scene. She announced that she had previously stated she made the finest cobbler on the street, and she wasn't in the habit of making claims she couldn't back up with proof. I stood up and accepted the dish from her hands. It was still radiating warmth. I told her that she really didn't have to go through the trouble, but she looked at me and said she wanted to do it, noting that there was a massive difference between obligation and desire. I want you to remember that phrase. I wanted to. There's a difference. Those words struck me deeply, right behind the sternum, and lingered in my mind. For the past 3 years of my life, every single act of supposed kindness or generosity from my family had come with strings attached. There was always a hidden expectation, an implied debt, or a strict condition. I gestured toward the empty chair and invited her to join me. She took a seat, and we ended up talking for over 2 hours as the sun went down. I learned that Thomas had been a much quieter man than she was, which she joked was strategically essential for the survival of their marriage. In return, I opened up to her about Martha. I told her how Martha used to completely reorganize my heavy metal toolbox whenever she was feeling anxious or overwhelmed about something. I explained that I always knew when something was weighing on her mind before she ever uttered a single word, because I would open my chest and find my flathead screwdrivers perfectly arranged by ascending size. Clara laughed at that memory, a deep, genuine laugh that echoed across the yard. She called that true love, describing it as the specific, inconvenient, slightly maddening kind that leaves a permanent mark on your soul. I nodded my head slowly, agreeing that was exactly what it was. We sat in silence for a moment after that. We were just two people who had loved deeply and lost their partners, sitting together on a porch, allowing the quiet evening to feel comfortable and full instead of empty and lonely. Then she stood up, adjusted her yellow cardigan, and reminded me that the ceramic dish belonged to her and she expected it returned completely clean. I promised her it would be, and as she walked back across her yard, I looked down at the dish and realized I was still smiling. By the 3rd week, we had fallen into a comfortable, unspoken routine, even though neither of us had ever explicitly suggested establishing one. That is the beauty of natural connections. They simply form themselves without the need for a formal discussion. We would drink our morning coffee on our respective porches, sometimes calling out to each other across the grass, and sometimes just enjoying the parallel existence. She would shout across the lawn, asking if I had actually eaten a proper breakfast or if I was relying on toast and stubbornness again. I would yell back that I had cooked fresh eggs and was a fully grown adult, to which she would counter that scrambled eggs didn't qualify as real culinary effort. On Thursday evenings, she attended a local book club that she routinely described as a gathering of 4 women drinking an enormous amount of wine while pretending to analyze classic literature. On Saturdays, I made it a point to walk over to the local market 2 blocks away. Without even realizing it at first, I began purchasing double of everything. I bought 2 bundles of fresh greens, 2 small jars of local honey, and 2 bags of the specific dark roast coffee she had mentioned liking during one of our casual conversations. She never made a big deal out of it. She simply accepted the coffee over the wooden fence the first time I handed it to her and remarked that I wasn't nearly as unobservant as I let on.
But this is the exact moment where the trajectory of the story shifts, and I need you to stay locked in with me. It was a Wednesday evening during my 3rd week in the new house. I was out in the backyard nailing down the very last section of the privacy fence because that leaning structure had been bothering me since my 5th day on the property, and I am not the type of man who can sleep soundly with unfinished business left undone. As I was working, the phone in my pocket began to vibrate. I pulled it out and saw Logan's name flashing across the screen. I stood there and stared at the display for a long moment. We had not spoken a single word to one another since that cold moving day in his driveway when I told his wife didn't have to give me an ultimatum either. I almost let the call go straight to voicemail. I truly almost did. But at the last second, I swiped the screen and answered, speaking his name. His voice sounded entirely different than usual. It was tight, strained, and filled with a high level of stress. He asked if I had a spare minute to talk. I told him I was in the middle of repairing my fence so he could talk while I continued working.
There was a long pause on the line before he finally asked how I was settling into the new place. I told him everything was fine and then asked how he was doing. Another silence stretched out between us, even longer this time, before he confessed that things had been incredibly difficult over the past few weeks. I stopped working and lowered my hammer. I know my son's voice perfectly, and the tone he was using told me that whatever he was about to say next was going to require my absolute, undivided attention. I asked him flatly what had happened, and that was when he finally revealed the truth. The logistics company, where Logan had been employed for the past 11 years, had been quietly undergoing a massive corporate restructuring since the beginning of the year. He had known the layoffs were looming, but he hadn't breathed a word of it to Cynthia, and he hadn't mentioned it to me either. He had been carrying the immense weight of that financial anxiety entirely on his own shoulders, which is a stubborn, unfortunate trait that men in the Vance family tend to possess. 2 weeks after I packed my bags and moved out of their house, the corporate budget cuts finally reached his department. He was walked out of the building and laid off on a Monday morning. I told him I was truly sorry to hear that, and I genuinely meant it from the bottom of my heart. Regardless of the betrayal that had transpired between us, and regardless of how poorly he had handled his wife's actions, that was still my boy. His suffering was still my suffering, and you can't simply flip a switch to turn off that kind of paternal instinct. He quickly tried to downplay the severity, claiming they would be fine for the time being because he had received a severance package and was actively searching for a new position. But then his voice trailed off into silence. I pressed him, asking what else was wrong. After another heavy pause, he finally admitted that Cynthia wanted to reach out to me. He explained that she had asked him to call and see if the 3 of us could possibly get together to have dinner. I picked up my hammer once again, looked at the wood, and told him that I would have to think about it. He pleaded softly, calling me Dad, but I repeated firmly that I would give it some thought, and that was all I could offer him in that moment. I hung up the phone. I stood there completely still in my backyard with the hammer resting in my hand, watching the final rays of the evening sun turn a brilliant, deep orange through the leaves of the old oak trees. Right then, a quiet, steady voice carried over the property line from next door. Clara asked if everything was all right on my side of the fence. I took a moment to evaluate my feelings honestly, which was an emotional habit she had already made me much better at practicing over the last 3 short weeks. I looked toward her and admitted that I honestly didn't know yet. A brief pause followed before she simply suggested that we eat some cobbler. Despite the overwhelming weight of Logan, Cynthia, the sudden job loss, the unexpected dinner invitation, and the incredibly complicated burden of broken family dynamics, I found myself laughing. I agreed that a bowl of cobbler sounded exactly like what I needed. What I didn't realize in that moment, and what none of us could have possibly anticipated, was that Cynthia's sudden desire to sit down for dinner had absolutely nothing to do with missing my presence or feeling remorse for her actions. It had everything to do with a financial storm that was about to break, a storm that was going to force every single one of us to look in the mirror and discover exactly what kind of character we truly possessed. There are defining moments that arrive without any grand announcement, no warning signs, no dramatic shifts in the wind, only to detonate the entire landscape of your life a split second later. This was precisely one of those moments. But before I take you inside that Sunday evening dinner, I need to detail exactly what transpired on the morning leading up to it. It was a Saturday, the day of the local farmers market.
I had just walked through my front door carrying my 2 bags of groceries, and yes, I was still buying double of everything, so let's skip the judgment. I was busy organizing the items on my kitchen counter when an unexpected knock echoed from the front door. It certainly wasn't Clara. She never used the front entrance, preferring to simply holler across the yard like a rational human being. I turned the handle and pulled the door open. Cynthia was standing out on my porch, completely alone. No sign of Logan, no advance warning, just her standing there, wrapped in a heavy charcoal coat I had never seen before, gripping the strap of her purse with both hands the way a person does when they desperately need something to hold on to. I froze, staring at her, and she stared right back at me. She broke the silence, addressing me by my name. I responded with hers, and a pause stretched out between us long enough to park a semi-truck in. She finally spoke up, admitting that Logan had absolutely no idea she had driven over to my place. I leaned my weight against the wooden doorframe and folded my arms across my chest, not in an aggressive stance, but in a thoroughly guarded one. I looked at her and suggested that if my son didn't know, perhaps she should explain exactly why she was standing on my porch. She looked past my shoulder, peering into the interior of the house for a fleeting second, before bringing her gaze back to my face. Something in her countenance had radically altered from the woman who had cornered me at that kitchen table weeks ago with her folded hands and her corporate boardroom authority. This version of Cynthia had been wearing thick armor. This version looked as though the armor had completely shattered weeks down the line, leaving her utterly exhausted from the sheer effort of trying to hold the pieces together. She quietly asked if she could step inside. I told her I would brew some coffee, and we went out to sit in the 2 wicker porch chairs I had purchased at a local estate sale during my second week in the house. 2 chairs just felt right at the time, even before I fully understood who would be occupying the second one. Cynthia wrapped both of her hands tightly around the warm mug, staring out at the massive oak trees for a long, silent interval before she found the words to speak. She began by stating slowly that she hadn't come to my home to ask me for a single dollar of my retirement money. I kept my eyes on her, telling her I heard her. She pressed on, insisting she was telling the truth, acknowledging that she knew exactly what I was expecting from her and that she had fully earned that negative expectation, but she reiterated that money wasn't the reason for her visit. I chose to stay completely silent. Over the course of my 67 years on this earth, I have discovered that remaining silent is frequently the most intelligent and effective response available to a man. She took a deep, shaky breath and confessed that Logan had no idea how catastrophic their financial situation actually was.
She explained that while he was aware of their standard expenses, he didn't know the truth about the second mortgage. My entire body went completely still at those words. She revealed they had quietly taken out that second mortgage 18 months prior, her voice taking on that incredibly strained, hyper-controlled cadence that people use when they are a single syllable away from a total emotional collapse. She brought up the online boutique business she had attempted to launch, the digital retail venture she had repeatedly assured Logan was thriving. I asked her bluntly if the venture had failed. She let out a short, hollow, bitter laugh. She admitted the entire business had completely collapsed within 4 months, costing her over $60,000 in losses. Ever since the failure, she had been secretly shifting funds between accounts, modifying spreadsheets, and frantically scrambling to keep Logan from discovering the truth. But now, with the sudden corporate layoff, her ability to hide the damage had vanished. She stopped speaking, set her coffee mug down on the table, and pressed her fingertips tightly against her eyes to hold back tears. She looked up and admitted they were exactly 4 months away from the bank foreclosing on the house. A soft breeze rustled through the oak trees, and a lone car drove slowly down Elmwood Terrace. I sat there looking at this woman, the exact same woman who had looked at me with cold calculation and ordered me to hand over my life savings or hit the bricks. And in that moment, I experienced an emotion I never anticipated feeling. It wasn't a sense of smug satisfaction, and it wasn't a feeling of vindication. It felt remarkably like genuine grief. I want you to stay locked into this specific part of the account, because this is where the core of the story resides. I immediately thought about Martha, about how she would meticulously rearrange every tool in my metal box whenever she was terrified about something she hadn't found the courage to tell me yet.
I thought about the deeply flawed, frustrating, intensely human habit of transforming raw terror into a desperate need for control. The instinct to grab onto whatever asset is closest to you when the ground begins to give way beneath your feet. Cynthia had been living in a state of absolute terror for 18 months straight. Instead of honest with her husband, she had looked at the 67-year-old retired lineman living in her spare room, looked at his untouched savings account, looked at his quiet daily routines and his free maintenance work, and she had made a desperate grab for his security. Her panic didn't make her actions right by any stretch of the imagination, but it made them entirely human. I looked at her carefully and asked why she was revealing all of this hidden damage to me instead of confiding in Logan. She remained silent for a long moment before whispering that she simply didn't know how to face him with the truth. She paused, swallowed hard, and added that she believed I was the only person left in her life who would give her the unvarnished truth about what her next steps should be. She explained that Logan loved her far too much to be completely objective right now, and she truly had no one else to turn to for guidance. That final sentence hit me with a completely different weight than she probably intended, because I could hear the raw reality buried beneath the words. It wasn't a calculated manipulation, and it wasn't a tactical strategy. It was just an exhausted woman who had been carrying a massive, crushing secret entirely alone for far too long. She was sitting on a porch she had absolutely no right to be occupying, begging a man she had deeply wronged to help her find her footing before she drowned. I picked up my coffee, took a slow sip, and set the mug back down. I looked her in the eye and told her that she had to tell him everything. She flinched at the demand. I repeated myself firmly, telling her she had to disclose the failed business, the second mortgage, the $60,000 deficit, all of it, and it had to happen tonight, well before we sat down for that Sunday dinner. Cynthia tried to protest, uttering my name, but I turned my body and looked at her with absolute directness. I reminded her that she had come to my home asking for the unvarnished truth, and that was the truth. I told her that the only thing more dangerous than the massive financial hole she was currently sitting in was allowing her husband to keep standing right on the edge of it without even knowing the drop was there. She stared back at me, her eyes becoming incredibly bright and glossy, in that distinct way that indicates a person is utilizing every ounce of sheer willpower to prevent themselves from crying. She asked what would happen after she confessed the truth to him. I informed her that whatever happened next would be strictly between her and Logan, but I made it an absolute requirement that she arrive at that Sunday dinner having already come completely clean to him. I told her that was my explicit condition. She questioned what I meant by a condition, and I looked her dead in the eye and told her it was my sole condition for showing up at that dinner table at all. She departed an hour later, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I sat out on the porch for a long while, watching the old oak trees sway in the lazy, indifferent breeze. The entire neighborhood felt incredibly peaceful and bathed in that warm, golden light that only accompanies a late Saturday morning in the early days of spring. Right on cue, Clara materialized at the edge of the wooden fence with a garden trowel gripped in one hand, because of course she did. She didn't look up from her pristine tomato beds, but she casually remarked that she had noticed a woman sitting out on my porch. I looked over and informed her that the visitor was my daughter-in-law. Clara turned over a fresh patch of soil with her trowel, cleared her throat slightly, and asked how the encounter had gone. I took a moment to evaluate the situation with absolute honesty, practicing the very mindset she had spent the last 3 weeks teaching me to adopt. I told her the meeting had gone significantly better than I had expected, but considerably worse than I had hoped. Clara gave a slow, knowing nod of her head and remarked that my description covered about 90% of human existence. I smiled and conceded that she was probably exactly right about that. She looked up at me then, just for a brief second, using that sharp glance she reserved for moments when she was deciding whether or not to voice her next thought. She stated simply that I was a good man, delivering the compliment with the same unshakable certainty a person uses to state a fact about the weather or global geography, before immediately turning her attention back to her plants. I sat with those words for a very long time.
The family dinner took place the following Sunday evening. The exact moment Logan pulled open the front door to let me inside, the very first thing that caught my attention was his eyes. They were heavily red-rimmed and exhausted in that distinct, profound way that only comes from a grueling hours-long conversation that strips a relationship completely down to its bare foundation. It was immediately obvious to me that Cynthia had followed my condition and laid out every single secret. Before I could even utter a greeting, Logan reached out and pulled me into a tight, desperate embrace. It wasn't a standard, polite hug. It was a real one, the kind that extends 4 or 5 seconds past the usual limit and communicates every single ounce of pain and regret that can't be organized into spoken sentences. He buried his face against my shoulder and whispered how much he knew. I held him tightly for a second and told him that I already knew too. The atmosphere around the dinner table was incredibly subdued at first. Cynthia had gone to the trouble of preparing a classic pot roast, which had been Martha's absolute favorite meal to cook, a detail I chose to accept as an intentional gesture of respect. The three of us sat together around the table, operating in that highly specific, quiet space inhabited by people who have already shouted the massive, life-altering truths and are now trying to figure out what ordinary, casual conversation is supposed to sound like again. After a few minutes, Cynthia set her fork down onto her plate, looked directly across the table at me, and cleared her throat. She told me that she owed me a profound apology, a genuine, real apology, not a superficial dinner-table attempt to smoothly gloss over the past. I kept my gaze fixed on her as she continued. Her voice remained steady, but I could tell that maintaining that composure in that kitchen was costing her every ounce of pride she possessed. She confessed that what she had said to me weeks ago was completely reprehensible. She acknowledged that I had done nothing but sacrifice and give to their family, yet she had treated me like an administrative problem to be coldly managed, and she wanted me to know she was truly, deeply sorry. The kitchen fell completely silent. Logan kept his eyes cast down, staring intently at his plate. I took a deep, deliberate breath, looked at her, and told her that I genuinely appreciated her words. I made it clear that I forgave her completely, because holding on to that kind of bitter resentment wouldn't do a single bit of good for any of us standing in this room. Cynthia gave a quick nod of relief and let out a long held-in exhale. But then I spoke up again, causing both of them to instantly look up and lock eyes with me. I told them firmly that I would not be moving back into their guest room under any circumstances, making it clear that specific chapter of my life was permanently closed. I explained that my decision didn't come from a place of lingering anger or malice, but rather from the fact that I had discovered something invaluable out on Elmwood Terrace that I didn't even realize I was missing, and I wasn't about to give it up. Logan looked at me with a mix of curiosity and confusion, asking me exactly what it was that I had found out there. My mind immediately flashed to the image of Clara Vance standing in her bright yellow cardigan on a porch chair I almost missed in the dark. I thought about her ceramic baking dish brought over like an item of evidence, her unyielding, rigid opinions regarding lawn maintenance, her Saturday morning tomato rituals, and that incredibly grounded, unhurried, independent way she navigated her way through the world like someone who had already weathered the absolute worst storms and emerged on the other side with flawless posture and superior recipes. I looked back at my son and told him that I had found peace. It was the absolute truth, even if it didn't represent the entire answer to his question. To Logan's absolute credit, he seemed to understand exactly what I meant. He looked at me for a long moment, and then a small, tired, but completely genuine smile broke across his face. He told me quietly that he was truly glad to hear that. We spent the next 3 hours sitting together, talking realistically about the house, the parameters of the second mortgage, and the various financial options available to them. I did not pull out my checkbook, and I did not write them a single draft. I didn't swoop in to magically rescue anyone from their choices that evening, but I did something much better. I helped Logan construct a clear, organized list of the exact phone calls they needed to make, the specific financial professionals they needed to contact, and the precise sequence of steps required for two people standing right on the precipice of a severe crisis who desperately needed an objective mind to help them see the landscape clearly instead of panicking into a total disaster. That was a service I could easily provide. It cost me absolutely nothing but my time, my life experience, and my perspective. When the time came for me to head home, Cynthia stepped forward and initiated a hug at the front door.
Her posture was incredibly stiff at first. She is naturally not a physically affectionate person, a personality trait that I actually deeply respect. But then I felt something in her shoulders completely drop, and the embrace became entirely real. She squeezed my shoulder and thanked me sincerely. I looked at her, told her to take good care of my son, and she promised me that she would. I believed her. I drove the 12 minutes back to Elmwood Terrace with the truck windows rolled all the way down, letting the crisp, clean spring night air wash over me. As I pulled onto my street, I noticed that Clara's front porch light was shining brightly. She was sitting right there in her wicker rocking chair, a hot mug of tea cradled in her hands, wrapped in that familiar yellow cardigan. It was 9:30 on a Sunday evening, yet she was positioned out there as if she was exactly where she was supposed to be in the grand scheme of things. I parked the truck, stepped out onto the pavement for a second, and stood at the base of my porch steps. Clara called across the dark lawn asking how the family dinner had turned out. I looked over and shouted back that it had been incredibly complicated. She gave a sharp nod of approval, as if my answer made perfect sense to her, and called back that my description was the absolute definition of family. I agreed completely. I stood there looking across the grass at her for a long moment. I looked at the dark silhouettes of the massive oak trees, the serene, quiet street, and the warm, inviting circle of golden light that her porch lamp threw around her rocking chair. I called out her name and asked if she would be open to having our morning coffee together tomorrow. I clarified that I didn't mean shouting across the property line this time, but actually sitting down together on either her porch or mine. I told her the location didn't matter to me. A brief silence settled between us.
Clara tilted her head slightly to the side, considering my invitation with the exact same serious, hyper-focused attention she routinely dedicated to her tomato beds and her rigid opinions. After a moment, she announced that we would meet on her porch, stating flatly that her brew was vastly superior to mine. I conceded the point, admitting that her brew truly was better. A genuine smile spread across her face, the real kind, the beautiful one that takes an entire lifetime of living and surviving to truly build. She told me to be there at exactly 7:30 and warned me not to be a single minute late. I walked up my steps, went inside my house, and sat down on the edge of my mattress. I reached out and picked up Martha's framed photograph from the nightstand, holding it in my hands the exact way I had done every single night since she passed away. I looked into her eyes and whispered to the quiet room that I was okay. I told her that I was actually, truly, completely okay. I set the frame back down gently on the wood, and for the first time in 3 long years, I meant every single word of it. True respect often only begins the exact moment you stop needing people to survive. But here is the beautiful secret I didn't understand when this painful journey first began. The moment you finally stop needing them is also the exact moment you discover precisely what you are worth as a man. And sometimes, just 12 minutes across town on a quiet terrace lined with ancient oak trees, sitting with a woman in a yellow cardigan who bakes the finest peach cobbler you've ever tasted, you find out that you were worth a whole lot more than you ever gave yourself credit for. My name is Arthur Vance. I am 67 years old, and I am finally, completely, entirely home. If you found Arthur's journey inspiring and want to hear more real, raw stories of family dynamics and hard-earned justice, make sure to support the channel. Take a brief moment to smash that like button and hit subscribe right now. It costs you absolutely nothing, but it makes a massive difference in helping us keep these narratives coming your way. Don't forget to drop a comment below sharing your thoughts on how Arthur handled his family's ultimatum. Thank you sincerely for listening, and we will see you right here for the next story.